at you, my pretty, and your little dog, too.
We are the weirdos, Minister. Twist the bones and bend the back. Here to decapit magic and mystery.
Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Come one, come all. See the sights that we at Lunar Tales have in store for you. Gaze upon the wonder that is desirable damsels, noble knights, and that deviously dastardly devil himself. Yes, that's right, my fair lords, ladies, and Lokis. We're talking witches today. Seductive sorceresses capable of reducing a sane man to a simple savage. Wild hags who cannibalize children and lay curses upon innocent virgins. Or the ideal image of female empowerment and freedom. We've got one of every kind here at Lunar Tales, as our witches will lead you through many lands and times, explaining as they do what exactly is special about them and how you, dear gentle viewer, can even become a witch yourself. Yes, it takes absolutely no magic at all, or perhaps more than you'd think. No deal with the devil, no crazy cults. Become a witch yourself for the low, low price of one like, comment, or subscribe. Laddies and gentle viewers, will you please put your hands together for the first host of tonight's grand performance. It's Mo the Movie Witch!
Can everybody hear me? Okay then. Hi, I'm Mo, and I'm just sort of the witch you know from movies. Honestly, the studio thought it would be best to send me out first because I'm probably what you think of first when you think of a witch, but I don't really know what I'm doing here. In fact, I've sort of been going through a bit of an identity crisis lately. I mean, back when I was being written for kids, I could be all sorts of things, like, do you remember Harry Potter? Those were good days. Being a witch meant both more and less than it ever had before. We were just the female equivalent of wizards, that's all. We weren't like our own separate being with our own set of skills and issues to face. And male witches were written out of existence completely, but magic often means something different in the hands of many modern Christian writers like J.K. Rowling. Magic is something fantastical now. I mean, sure, Rowling herself admitted that she drew a lot of influence from the ancient science known as alchemy, but her handling of it is pure fantasy, and we can easily recognize it as such. No real wand will ever produce results like this. That's just ridiculous. It's imagination. It's not real. And in Harry Potter, you're either born a witch or you're a muggle. There is no crossover. This is a point that you're probably more familiar with if you've read the books, especially with their discussion around squibs like Filch and muggle-born witches like Hermione and Lily Potter. In the Harry Potter universe, squibs are people who are born into magical families but do not possess any magical abilities themselves. In the Chamber of Secrets, when the subject of blood purity becomes more of a talking point,
My blood.
we learn that the major reason why Filch experiences such borderline homicidal hostility towards the children is because he's a squib and he experiences deep shame for that. We see that he's still actively trying to learn magic after all these years, and he's faced nothing but repeated failure. He was not born a wizard, so he'll just never be able to perform magic. So, knowing this, what can we assume would happen if, say, Hermione's parents were so proud of their little girl's achievements in magic that maybe they wanted to see if they could, just learn a couple spells here or two? Well, that would just be impossible, right? We even see that proven in the Deathly Hallows, as it's Petunia's inability to become a witch that ends up destroying her relationship with Lily Potter, and ultimately turns her into a bitter and angry woman. What can I say? J.K. Rowling just says that some people are born better than others. But at the same time, there are a lot of benefits to a writer representing magic as this, fantasy thing that only specific, special, non-human people are able to access. especially if you're writing for a Christian audience, which J.K. Rowling clearly was. Depending on how many years you've been on this planet, you may or may not remember those days when people were saying that reading Harry Potter was literally the same as devil worship.
Some parents have steered their kids away from reading the Harry Potter books or even watching the movies because they may allude to satanic or unchristian ideals.
Her daughter got rid of her witchcraft books, got rid of her Harry Potter books, and gave her heart back to the Lord and didn't have the problem anymore.
And had it been in the Old Testament, Harry Potter would have been put to death.
Well, my co-star Sammy will explain that whole phenomenon in a little bit, but for now, suffice it to say that as a Christian writer herself, this clearly upset J.K. Rowling.
J.K. Rowling responded to some of those early objections by talking about how she was actually a person of faith, that she had modeled the shape of the entire Harry Potter narrative, all 4,100 pages of it, on the Christian gospel.
And it may have had an influence in her writing in the sense that she wanted her witches to come across as a-religious as possible. By making witchcraft something that you're born with and can't possibly change about yourself, you take away any possibility that their specialness was earned through some sort of deal with the devil or any malicious act of their own. Witches in Harry Potter are not inherently good or evil. Each one is led by their own moral compass. And while witches can use magic for malicious purposes, this is usually motivated by some sort of inflated sense of self or another character flaw. But then, I grew up. I'm running with a new crowd these days, and ever since J.K. Rowling started talking about trans issues, they don't really approve of her anymore. In the 2021 Fear Street movie, for example, witchcraft is equated with queer femininity standing in the face of a world that assumes that everything revolves around men. In the 2020 film Gretel and Hansel, which incidentally was directed by Oz Perkins, son of closeted queer actor Anthony Perkins, who made a name for himself playing Norman Bates in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, only to die a quiet and private death related to AIDS, is all about how Gretel escapes from patriarchal expectations by literally becoming a forest-dwelling witch, separated from all of society. And although it is a remake of a movie that took a slightly darker interpretation of witchcraft, 2020's The Craft Legacy uses witchcraft as a metaphor for sisterhood, which, of course, includes trans women. By standing together and supporting other women, that creates a form of magic that can be used to defeat the patriarchy. As a result, witchcraft has almost become synonymous in recent movies with female power and a primarily feminine form of queerness. And while that definitely has a lot of value that can't be undermined, I know I have at least a friend or two that finds that we can add just a little bit more to that definition. I'm gonna hand this over to one of my co-stars in a minute here, but before I do, the studio said that I at least have to mention all the times that I've been a villain in movies. Yeah, sorry, my co-stars will explain all that. Bye.
Burn her! Burn her! You've seen her face on every wanted poster across colonial America. Known for dancing naked with the devil and working on a Sunday. Give it up for Sammy the Salem Witch. When ye think of witches before the days of moving pictures, what ye probably imagine be witch hunts and an era of mass hysteria. Ye might even think that witches be nothing more than fancy, the product of bored Puritans arguing. And it is very true that the things written about me were intense. Now, witch hunts, of course, did not begin in Salem. Witch hunts are primarily a Christian practice, meaning that in the pre-Christian days of yore, they weren't really a thing, but Good Person Pip will get into all that soon enough. And simply as a result of the way that history tends to be poorly recorded, we really don't know when the first witch hunt was. But I can give you the name of the man who set the precedents for witch hunts. Heinrich Kramer. It happened in a marketplace in Innsbruck in 1485. My name was Helena Scheuberin that day, and I already had a bit of a reputation among the townspeople. I'm known for being outspoken and aggressive, but I'm married to a rich burgher, so what can you do?
When that witch hunting nut Kramer blew into town, I refused to entertain that nonsense. I accused him of being in league with the devil right in his own church, and then I told all my girlfriends to start avoiding those sermons. And when I saw him that day in the marketplace in Innsbruck, I spat on him. And I said, "Fie on you, you bad monk. May the fallen evil take you." That was the day that Kramer vowed to destroy me. He put me on trial. He accused me of using magic to kill the knight Jorg Spice, which is just ridiculous. You know, the man was gravely ill. The fact that his doctor was convinced that I might, speed things along if he came to visit me had nothing to do with it. For a night, he made quite an irritating house guest. But here's the thing that Kramer didn't expect. The authorities at Innsbruck didn't necessarily consider witchcraft what the babes would call a big deal in Helena Schuberin's day. Even if I had gangs of the night, all I would have gotten was a slap on the wrist. But that wasn't enough for old Kramer. He just didn't get it, you know? He was one of those Dominican order lads sent here specifically to hunt and kill witches. And he specifically did not like me. He berated me about my entire sexual history right there on the stand, most of which was untrue, by the way. Although I may have tried out a few of his suggestions after the trial, and let me just say, lad had imagination. Really, it just became awkward for everyone, and Helena Scheuberin was set free. But that doesn't mean that Heinrich Kramer forgot about me. He wanted to stay in Innsbruck and continue hunting witches, but the bishop considered the whole thing kind of an embarrassment. To borrow the vernacular of the babes yet again, he slut-shamed me in front of everyone. Me! Do you even know who my husband is, witch hunter? So Kramer stepped down and started working on a book instead. The Malleus Maleficarum, the ultimate witch hunter's guide.
Tell me, have you ever had someone disagree with you? Are you sick of having to deal with pesky opinions? Well, do I have the solution for you? The Malleus Maleficarum, also known as burning, torturing, and hanging anyone who disagrees with you, especially women, because those dumb sluts don't know what they're talking about. Am I right, fellas? Remember, your opinions come from God, and that makes you always right. Ipso facto, their opinions must come from the devil, which makes it perfectly okay to imprison them, murder their families, and break every last bone in their body until they confess to being the worst scum imaginable. Then we'll probably just kill them off after, cause who cares? You're winning every argument. Old widow acting a little ornery? Torture. Starving farmer plowing his field on a Sunday? Torture. Stupid slut spit on you in the marketplace? Cheat on you or something? I don't know. Torture! Trust me, life is much easier when you just kill everyone you don't like.
Witch hunts spread throughout Europe throughout the following centuries, most of them using the Malleus Maleficarum as their basis. It's difficult to say exactly how many people were killed as a result of this, but scholars currently estimate somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000. So this be the story of how one man became indirectly responsible for the horrific murder of thousands of people because one opinionated woman inspired a book about witchcraft. Yeah, so how's hell looking down there, Kramer?
It's nothing but women refusing to tell me how great I am. I can't take it anymore.
Don't worry. I'll be down there to join them soon enough. Anyway, there is a very clear reason why sexually empowered women, and queer people in particular, would gravitate towards the figure of the witch. From a Christian perspective, the witch is someone who doesn't belong, someone who doesn't follow the rules. A non-Christian, if you will. Sexually empowered and queer people are often outright rejected from Christian communities, which would have put them at a higher risk of being accused if a witch hunt were to suddenly break out. But they were far from the only people at risk, and a good example of this would be looking at the list of accused from the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts between 1692 and 1693. Of the 20 people who were killed as Salem witches, 14 of them were women and 6 of them were men. Clearly there was a reason why women were attacked in higher numbers, but men were far from safe. In fact, that year, I took the form of Giles Corey, an 80-year-old man who had been found guilty once before of beating his servant to death. When he was arrested under suspicion of witchcraft, he was faced with a choice. He could confess to being a witch and have his property seized, or he could deny being a witch, be hanged, and still have his property seized. Because yes, those were your only options after you were accused of being a witch in Salem, as denying being a witch was seen as simply being in denial. In fact, this belief was so deeply held that there are even accounts of European witch hunters convincing people that they had become witches by making deals with devils in their sleep during dreams they were not conscious of having. At this point, these quote-unquote witches would believe that they had accidentally damned themselves to hell forever. Giles Corey wasn't that sort, though. He knew that he hadn't made any deals with the devil. And he wasn't about to lose the farm that he had planned to pass on to his 5 children because of a complete lie. He could accept death, sure. He was an old man now. But he couldn't accept leaving this earth without leaving something for his children. So he did the only thing that he thought he could. He refused to say anything at all. There was, of course, a punishment attached to refusing trial, but at the time, the punishment hadn't been enacted on American soil. And neither has it been performed since. Giles Corey was pressed to death. Pressing is an excruciatingly long process during which they continuously add stones to your body until you are just eventually crushed to death. It took 2 days in Giles Corey's case, but they still couldn't make him confess to a lie. There's even an account of his tongue lolling out of his mouth and a sheriff pushing it back in with his cane, and yet he said nothing. His last words were reported to be "more weight" before he passed away. And then they seized his property anyway. Happy stories all around, I'm sorry. The Salem witch also took the form of Tituba, a Colombian slave who had been accused of witchcraft when it was discovered that she was sharing her culture with the priest's daughter. She was the first witch accused in Salem, and although she wasn't among the hanged, we don't necessarily know what happened to her afterwards. So clearly it wasn't only sexually empowered white women who would have been accused. Women were just assessed more harshly than men on average in Christian societies. But there is another side to all this that we've been ignoring. We've identified who the witches are from my perspective, but what exactly is magic? Well, early Christians didn't tend to think of magic in the Harry Potter, maybe she's born with it approach to magic sort of way, as the church didn't think of magic as being something that humans were capable of wielding. Either God was responsible, like when Moses transfigured his staff into a serpent, or this human may have sold their soul to the devil and been granted special powers as a result. Any last words, witch? Just one. Balenciaga. Now, early Christianity tended to believe that anyone who didn't follow God ipso facto followed the devil. And so magic here is more than anything the fear of what people who don't follow a Christian way of life may be capable of. Violence and heightened sexuality were feared from both genders, but to different degrees. And with non-Christian women, there was also this intense fear that they may be bad mothers. Witches were often depicted cannibalizing children or baptizing babies in fire in the name of the devil, just to prove how scary non-maternal and/or non-Christian women were. There are also multiple theories as to why witches fly around on broomsticks. One of them being that broomsticks are an image of domestication. And when witches use those broomsticks to fly off to parties with the devil in the woods, they really aren't using those broomsticks in the good, productive, cleaning way that Christian women would. So yes, Christian peoples of a witch hunting culture did tend to believe in a form of magic that was fantastical, such as being able to send a demon to someone that you had quarreled with to send them illness or bad luck. But it was often a definition of magic that played on a real fear. The fear of what someone who doesn't follow the Bible's teachings may be capable of. And that ranged between everything from committing murder to just not going to church, depending on how radical the Christians in your area were. Egads, it is the very fiend himself. I must go. Hide! Save yourself! Oh, hi. I'm Pip, the pagan witch, and why don't you join me over there? Weather's a little nicer. That's better. And now that snoozefest Sammy has finished telling you guys all about the people who had the label of witch forced upon them, I'm here to tell you about the people who call themselves witches. We're a lot cooler and less miserable, trust me. So fill up your goblets with wine and take off your clothes. We're getting heathen up in these woods. So the history of pagan witchcraft, as with all things, follows the cycle of the spiral. Circling around and around, seemingly in the same place, but expanding ever outward. And history is recorded by the victors. Christianity has been the dominant religion in the West since roughly the Middle Ages. And Christians haven't always been the most respectful when it comes to representing other cultures. So you're gonna have to enter into all this with an open mind. Now we're gonna be covering a lot of ground here, but first I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. Say hello to Wicket the Wiccan Witch. Merry meet, Pip. Now, when we think of the modern witch, our minds often go to the Wiccan religion. Netflix's recent adaptation of Sabrina the Teenage Witch even borrows the name to evoke this general idea of witchiness.
The Women's Intersectional Cultural and Creative Association, Wicca.
But the Wiccan religion is actually incredibly complex with an extremely obscure history. So the way that we understand it today, Wicca began in England in roughly the 1950s by a man named Gerald Gardner. Gardner was a fairly average guy, until he became acquainted with a group of people calling themselves witches in 1936. He was initiated into their coven and taught their secrets, but Gardner found it a bit of a shame that there were so few among their numbers that the culture seemed to be at risk of dying out. So he broke the secret society cardinal rule and went public, revealing everything he could in a series of books, including 1954's Witchcraft Today. He did apparently face some trouble from his original coven for spilling the beans, but by that point he was already considered the founding father of England's first original religion, and it all just sort of snowballed from there. But what exactly were these big secrets held only by extremely private witches? Well, possibly the best way to think of it would be a simplification and modernization of pre-Christian European polytheism and what we would consider today to be superstition. So in Wicca, multiple deities are recognized, but who exactly those deities are kind of changes depending on the Wiccan. Some prefer to pray to the Greek pantheon of gods. Some prefer the Norse gods, or the Egyptian gods, or the Irish gods. Basically, it's whatever tradition speaks to you. But typically, it's some culture that has a wide assortment of gods that all represent different ideas. Because in Wicca, the gods themselves don't matter so much as the ideas that they represent. So for example, from a Wiccan perspective, Aphrodite wouldn't be like an actual physical lady that sits there on Mount Olympus seducing cows. Rather, she'd be the primitive human attempt to personify the universal energy of love, which would otherwise be too grand for us to comprehend. But by giving that energy a name, a personality, and an identity, you have a means of interacting with that energy, and maybe even open up a conversation with it. Because of this, every Wiccan has their own individual relationship with their deities, as these are all concepts that humans approach and understand differently. But let's say that I, Wicket the Wiccan Witch, wanted to cast a spell. What does that mean? Well, there are a number of traditions and ceremonies that go into this, but to boil it all down to essentials, what you're trying to do is get in touch with these cosmic energies and maybe just, manipulate them a little bit in your favor. Let's go back to Aphrodite for a second. Let's say that I wanted someone to fall in love with me. So what I would do is I would honor the goddess Aphrodite in the hopes that she might begin to favor me a little bit more. Maybe she'll even recognize the love that I have in my heart and extend that energy out a little bit. In a lot of ways, Wiccan magic can sort of be compared to the idea of manifestation, or even the fake it till you make it mentality. When you focus on love, love grows, but That being said, it still isn't as simple as that in Wicca. Just because you cast a spell, that doesn't necessarily mean that the universal energies are going to work in your favor. For example, if you ask for something that offends the gods or potentially sullies the idea that they're supposed to represent, then instead of getting what you want, you'll have it returned to you 3 times over.
Whatever you send out, you get back ×3.
You also can't ask for anything that disrupts the cosmic plan of the god and the goddess, who we haven't really touched on yet, but they're sort of like the most important deities within Wicca. They're both very connected to the earth and the changing of the seasons, but at the same time, they're very connected to this idea of masculine and feminine energies, if you want to think of it in that whole yin and yang sort of way. The horned god represents masculine energy, so he's very connected to things like hunting, aggression, and dominant sexuality. He is a concept borrowed from many pagan cultures, the most famous and obvious example being the Greek Pan. Meanwhile, the triple goddess represents feminine energy, so she's usually represented as nurturing but wrathful. And she's extremely tied in with ideas around fertility and death. Again, this is basically a concept that we've seen back to the beginning of time. Such as the Venus of Willendorf, a fertility statue that dates back about 25,000 years. And so asking for anything that might disrupt that intended cycle just won't work out in your favor. Again, this sounds like a complicated concept, but it basically just boils down to some things just aren't meant to be because fate. So, according to Gerald Gardner, traditional Wicca is supposed to honor the god and the goddess equally, but over time, many Wiccans have begun to prioritize the goddess over the god. This may be partly due to the influence of fantasy writer Marion Zimmer Bradley, who wrote stories of female witches in pagan times who served as priestesses to the goddess. In real life, Bradley was accused of abusing her own children and of, forgiven known maps, so she was a pretty terrible person. But all that being acknowledged, one thing that she did pretty well in fiction was depicting female characters escaping gendered persecution through the goddess. Or as we've already established, the goddess represents feminine power. So if any female reader is dealing with gendered persecution at the time, the message that she's receiving is, you can escape the patriarchy through witchcraft. This is technically true, but it's also led to the interpretation that Wicca is a religion practiced exclusively by women and queer people. In recent years, there's even emerged a subsect of Wicca referred to as Dianic Wicca, which honestly gets misunderstood a lot of the time. The focus of the practice is celebrating female deities and healing the wounds that women have sustained from the patriarchy. But because men aren't allowed in Dianic witchcraft spaces, and there's even an argument about the inclusion of trans people, it does come across as a little exclusionary. But that isn't to say that Wicca as a religion is exclusionary. In fact, most Wiccans believe that the whole point to these cosmic energies is that they remain in balance, and that upsetting that balance is what tends to cause problems. As human beings, we are all equally capable of being influenced by masculine and feminine energies. Someone who lives their life without any respect for the feminine energy within both themselves and other people would probably struggle with empathy and emotion in general. And they may even be violent or sexually aggressive. Meanwhile, someone who lives without any respect for the masculine energies in themselves and other people would be far too emotional and passive, either in the sense that they come across as lazy or they just aren't protecting themselves from harm. So, for instance, Michael Myers might be considered an example of somebody with way too much masculine energy, whereas 1990s Harley Quinn would be an example of somebody with way too much feminine energy, you know, taking out the violence and stuff. It's hard to find characters with too much feminine energy because they just don't make interesting characters, you know? So getting back to our example, 90s Harley is willing to put aside herself completely in the name of love, even to the point that she puts herself in harm's way and forgives the Joker's abuse.
My fault. I didn't get the joke.
She also fails to recognize that the Joker is undeserving of her love. Frankly, because Harley just experiences too much love and too much emotion.
You found me!
So much for self-esteem.
These traits can definitely be a strength in the right situation, but in Harley's specific circumstance, her overabundance of feminine energy has become dangerous to her, and also to anyone else who tries to point out that the Joker is undeserving of her love. In the case of Michael Myers, on the other hand, he's so cut off from his own emotions that he hardly even seems to recognize what these emotions are when they come up. He's also overly aggressive and appears to experience disdain for perceived weakness. Again, there are situations where being able to cut off your own emotions is invaluable, but doing that all the time can make you dangerous to be around. But most people aren't either 90s Harley or Michael Myers. We all interact with these energies to different degrees at different points in our lives. For example, a healthier, more balanced person in Harley's situation might be willing to extend love to someone in a difficult situation. But once that person started taking advantage and hurting her, even if she did continue to love that person, she'd be able to cut herself off from her emotions long enough to make herself safe.
You treated me bad. What? You lied to me. You never loved me. I know that now.
A healthier, more balanced person in Michael Myers' situation would just experience empathy for the people around them and not kill them. I don't know what to tell you there. Most people do tend to interact with one energy more than the other, and that's perfectly okay because neither of these energies are bad. It's just important to honor the balance within yourself and live your life with respect for both. So by that understanding, there's absolutely no reason why a man can't be a witch. But being a male witch means respecting both the masculine and feminine energy within yourself and within other people. Just like being a witch of any other gender means the same thing. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here, and Wicca, well, fairly simple once you get used to it. Can seem kind of disorienting when you're first introduced, just because it's so outside the Christian norm. But fortunately, there's only one solid commandment that all Wiccans follow, and it harm none, do what ye will. Admittedly, this is still a concept that can prove confusing, because how do you define harm? Sometimes harm is inevitable. For example, leaving a bad relationship may end up breaking the other person's heart. But staying in that relationship may prove more psychologically damaging to you in the long run. In situations like that, Wiccans would suggest that you follow the path that offers the least amount of long-term harm. And sort of like follow the procedures of an airplane crashing. You know, if you don't adjust your own oxygen mask before helping another, you won't be alive to help anyone. And if you don't take care of yourself first and foremost, you're gonna end up causing more harm than good. Another decent, more modern interpretation of the Wiccan Rede might be, do no harm, but take no shit. Oh, and before we return to Pip, yes, most Wiccans are sex positive. Sex is viewed as an act that honors the masculine and feminine energies involved, regardless of the actual genders of the people involved. So really, have as much or as little sex as you want, any way you want to. As long as it's consensual, remember that anything otherwise is viewed as an offense to the goddess. Obviously, there's more to Wicca than that, but I've confused you enough for one day. Merry may we meet again. Thank you, Wicket. That was very informative. But how is it even possible that Gerald Gardner just happened upon a coven of witches? Who were these people? Well, I mean, I guess it's always possible that these people just didn't exist and Gardner wanted to start his own religion and thought this little backstory would add some legitimacy. But regardless, as Wicket pointed out, many of Gardner's beliefs are very reflective of pre-Christian European beliefs. When Christianity began to spread throughout Europe, it wasn't necessarily the easy process you might be imagining. Primitive peoples did not view their own beliefs as primitive. That was their way of life. And so when the Christians came along, commanding that everyone start bowing down to a single male god who hated sex, a lot of people found that kind of oppressive. So what early Christians needed to do was, coax them into it, both gently and by force. Many pagan beliefs were reappropriated into Christianity to, ease the transition. If you did feel uncomfortable praying to a single male god, then you had the Virgin Mary as an option. Many pagan holidays were turned into Christian holidays. For example, Yule became Christmas. And many pagan gods or goddesses were transformed into either demons or witches. For example, in Germanic culture, pagans held the goddess Berchta Wicca as sacred. She was a protector of women and children, she watched over the woods, and she would lead the dead into the afterlife. When the Catholic Church came into the Alpines in the 6th century, women in particular had a very difficult time letting go of their beloved goddess. And so the church came up with a quick and easy solution, telling these women that Berchta wasn't a goddess at all. She was a witch that carried around a knife to slit open the bellies of children, and anyone who continued to pray to her must be in league with the devil. This failed to wipe Berchta out entirely, but this did turn her into the ghost story of Frau Perchta, or the belly slitter. Now, it's also important to mention that witchcraft was viewed differently by Christian cultures than by pagans. Pagans viewed magic as an everyday part of life, whereas Christians believed that everything either came from God or the devil. So, from a pagan perspective, being labeled a magic wielder of any sort was almost an honor. It pretty much just meant that you were really good at something. But according to Exodus 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. It wasn't only the pagan goddesses who were given the Christian witch makeover either. It was the real people who were actually viewed as witches at the time. But who were these people, and what was this magic they were practicing? Well, that's sort of difficult to answer because, again, history is written by the victors, these things are poorly recorded, blah blah blah. Anyway, we do have a few theories, and I'm gonna hand this over to Wicket for the first one. The dominant theory within Wiccan circles is that these witches were little more than pagans who refused to let go of their beliefs in the face of Christian persecution. This explains why many witches were depicted as old hags, as elderly people would have been more set in their ways than the more suggestible youth. These pagans managed to continue thriving throughout the centuries by staying quiet and obedient within a Christian world, only sharing their knowledge with their own children and those they knew they could truly trust. Right up until Gardner spilled the beans, of course. Another theory, with perhaps a bit more academic weight behind it, whatever that means, is that pagans simply understood things differently than we do. As I kinda hinted at before, being a magic user probably meant that you were proficient in a certain set of skills that most people at the time just weren't. Like, say, medicine or astronomy, something that would have appeared to be magic from the perspective of someone who just had no idea what was going on. It also was not at all uncommon for pagan cultures to, overly mythologize people who had simply done a great thing, as that may have simply been their way of understanding and recording their own history. And not to mention, you do have to consider that most people were illiterate in those days. And so a lot of these stories were passed along orally, and it basically became just this whole big game of telephone. For example, King Arthur is believed to be a result of extremely early Christians over-mythologizing the accomplishments of multiple war leaders, perhaps most notable among them being Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Roman British military leader who helped bring Christianity to the pagan people of the British Isles. As you may note, many Arthurian stories deal with King Arthur fighting against witches or some other form of magic. Or a less glamorizing way to think of that would be converting pagans by force, which is exactly what Ambrosius Aurelianus did, by the way. This magic also became more fantastical over the course of retellings, and most of the really early King Arthur texts focus more on the battle descriptions than on the actual magic. For example, King Arthur becoming kin by pulling the sword from the stone wasn't added to the mythology until T.H. White's The Sword in the Stone in 1938. Originally, he just became kin the way anyone becomes kin. And Merlin, who may be one of the most famous magic wielders in the King Arthur mythology, was originally more of a prophet in King Arthur's aid. He was described as having some level of magic, but again, it was often referred to as a science rather than a magic. And on top of that, they threw in this whole backstory about him being the son of an incubus who converted to Christianity. Yeah, Christian writers. But yeah, that was supposed to be the explanation originally for how he got his powers. But, hi, Greg. It was Incubus' father. This version of Merlin is also heavily inspired by the more grounded legend and potentially true story of Myrddin Wyllt, a Welsh pagan who had spent some time with the kin as his bard. But he chose to retreat from society after the untimely death of his sister. While living as a recluse, he became convinced that he was a prophet and may have even seen his own death. Something that terrified him so much that he converted to Christianity immediately, only to die that very same day. You can definitely see how this story might be a little bit odd, but it's definitely a far cry from the version of Merlin that we often see represented today. Another, less influenced by Christianity version of this form of storytelling would be the ancient Chinese legend, Great Yu Controlled the Waters, which tells of this great hero who learned how to magically tame the waters. But most historians believe that, while there is no concrete evidence that Yu was definitely a real man, if he was probably just an engineer who built a really great dam and became mythologized for it. This was simply the way that our early ancestors seemed to understand things. But there also may have been an early attempt to recognize and categorize different forms of magic with the different words that were used towards magic wielders. Essentially, from a pagan perspective, a witch would have been someone who sold holistic medicines. As the gatherers within traditional societies, women would have been better equipped than anyone to know what plants did what. They would have shared that information with other women, and if they happened to get good enough at that information, they would have been in the rare position to be able to provide for themselves as women, which meant that they would have had more choice about whether or not they wanted to get married or have children. These sorts of holistic healers also would have had an extremely controversial reputation once Christians blew into town, as a big part of their job would have been serving as midwives or helping women perform abortions. So while men definitely could have served as witches, the main reason why the church was offended by this industry is because it would have been overrun by women who believed in female and bodily autonomy. Wizard, meanwhile, may have been a word used for someone who, from our perspective, would have required a little bit more formal education, because they were working more within the realms of something like science or storytelling. Some sort of skill-based space that wasn't necessarily medicinal in nature and therefore didn't depend on the growth of plants to be performed. When we're talking about pre-Christian times, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that the world that they understood may as well have been a different planet compared to what we know now. And so dismissing pagan people as stupid is really unfair to them. To them, magic wasn't fantasy. It was something they got to experience every time they encountered something new and awe-inspiring. But to return to Gerald Gardner for a minute, I don't know if we can 100% disregard his claim to have run into a pocket of people in Europe who still held on to some sort of pagan belief. There are pagan communities alive to this day, including the Mari people of Russia, although their beliefs are mildly different from Gardner's, in the sense that most Wiccans aren't really down for animal sacrifice. In fact, many Wiccans interpret that whole no-harm bit to include animals and choose to be vegetarian. Wiccans are just city pagans. I think that's what I'm realizing here. Anyway, point is, paganism is really a wide variety of beliefs that really just means non-Christian. So it's not really like there's a consensus on anything. And
hey, this is YouTube. People don't have the attention span for your full life story. Finish it up, you filthy pagan.
I guess that's my cue. Anyway, let me just leave you with this. Pagans are not Satan worshippers. Most of us don't even believe in the devil because we're not Christians.
Oh, there are many more witches we could show you. Voodoo witches who combine Christian traditions with African paganism. Satanic witches who believe in nothing but have learned that the word witch holds incredible power when used against Christians. But fortunately for you, you get to leave early. The writer wants a word with you. So we here at Lunar Tales will cease to be until our master has use for us again. And you all get to keep living because you're real. Lucky you. Well, here they come. The one, the only, Kira Celine.
So yeah, as I was saying, there are other types of people who might be considered witches of sorts. And I don't mean to ignore those, but I don't want to bog this video down too much. And I also wanted to focus mostly on the types of witches that would have contributed most prominently to our Western understanding of the witch. Greg, first of all, you have me squeezed in a corner here, and secondly, you're eating things. Bye. It feels like the figure of the witch is one that has gone through a lot of transformations lately, and I sort of wanted to go back and not only track how we got here, and maybe even offer up my own definition of a modern witch figure using a combination of pretty much all of these definitions. But before we get into that, it would be irresponsible for me not to mention that there is a spiritual element to all of this magic stuff that can be extremely beneficial to some people. But in the worst of situations, it can also make you somewhat susceptible to extremely dangerous beliefs. I will admit this right now, I am a Wiccan. I have been for about 4 or 5 years now, I think. I can't remember exactly. And it is an important part of my life. But that being said, my search for further knowledge within this religion has definitely put me in the same room with people who, have an overinflated sense of self, we'll say. And not only that, but when I turned to these people asking for help with my mental health problems, they told me that I was possessed by an evil spirit that had basically targeted me because I was just such a downer. So yeah, I'm now developing some more masculine energy by hunting for therapy. But I'll also admit that I was already pretty open to alternative perspectives, we'll say. My dad's a Buddhist and my mom's a yoga teacher. Whatever you want to call that whole system of beliefs nowadays. New Age spiritualism, I guess. So I was already familiar with concepts such as energy. Oh, hi Greg, you're back. And I've always believed in reincarnation, both of which are big parts of Wicca. Plus, I'm not really like an organized religion person, and Wicca's like super chill. There's no church, I don't have to dress up and see anybody if I'm not feeling it that day. I get my spiritual recharge by walking in the woods, and all that's great. Plus, the fact that every Wiccan interprets the religion their own way opens up a lot of space for independent thought, which I personally like. You just have to be a little bit discerning with navigating a witch's space, and expect that some pagan witches might just act like Christian witches towards you. So yeah, make sure that you're protecting yourself. But that being said, I also think that's just to be expected from any big group of people. And Christians aren't exactly innocent of this form of dangerous and delusional spiritualism either. Like, I once had a friend whose Christian parents exorcised her for depression, and now she's an atheist, and I completely understand why. People suck sometimes, man, but just focus on staying true to you and work through everything with a balance of empathy and logic. Sometimes that's all you can do. Okay, getting back to witches. So technically, if you wanted to be a witch from a traditional perspective, the only thing that you would need to do is refuse to subscribe to the Christian faith and then make some sort of impact on the world. The problem I think we've been facing more and more as a modern culture is that if you're defining a witch simply by someone who doesn't follow the Bible, then that kind of means that someone like Richard Ramirez could be considered a witch just as much as someone like Malala. That just doesn't feel right nowadays, you know what I mean? Especially to someone who does see value in standing up to these patriarchal traditions. You know, there definitely is this side to the witch that's very romantic and empowering, because it is simply a historical fact that many, many women were put to death simply for being outspoken, or sexually active, or intelligent, or God forbid, all three. And so it's very tempting from a modern perspective to interpret magic as sort of like this collective female anger towards the patriarchy that tortured and murdered their ancestors. But I also think that Wicca did something pretty interesting by trying to introduce this concept of like witch morality, you can kind of say. The Wiccan rule is that you are free to do what you want, provided that it doesn't hurt anyone. I think that is proof that many people who don't necessarily follow a traditional religion still look for some sort of moral structure to their lives. Which might sound ridiculous to some, but you still hear this argument from some Christians to this day, that if you don't believe in God or the rules of Christianity, then what's to stop you from causing harm? I feel like you can also see this sort of attitude in the way that a lot of conservatives nowadays will talk about queer men as though they're at some sort of higher likelihood to be maps, as though simply loving men makes you less sexually moral. I don't know, it's not a perspective that I can personally identify with, but I do think that it's one that fed into witch hunts a lot of the time. This idea that people who don't act according to the social norm are all the same and we need to keep an eye on them because we don't know what they might do. Wiccans, meanwhile, actively deny this whole Christian perspective, all well set in this moral standard of no harm. You know, I didn't focus on Satanism a lot in this video because Satanists don't actually believe in any deities or in magic. But in the same sort of vein, if you visit the website for the Satanic Temple, the first thing listed on their 7 tenets is that one should strive to act with compassion and empathy toward all creatures in accordance with reason. The tenets then go on to list things like asking for consent, putting science before your own personal beliefs, and taking accountability. I don't want to compare Wicca and Satanism too much because in a lot of ways they are polar opposites. You know, Satanists don't believe in anything, Wiccans kind of just believe in everything. But at the same time, they seem to have this similar intention of actively denying Christianity, all while setting a new moral standard. And they both embrace witch imagery. So this is the part of the video where I let Glenda ask a question.
Are you a good witch or a bad witch?
So technically, as a woman, the only thing you would need to do to fit the witch stereotype would be to challenge tradition. But in order to be considered a moral witch, you would also need to live your life causing as little harm to others as possible, and obviously to yourself. But what would the embodiment of witch energy look like to the modern man? Well, again, I think we simply have this idea of challenging tradition. But that being said, I am aware that this concept of a moral male witch has been sort of muddled by men who may have a different understanding of the term no harm. Women who exist within these more witchy spiritualist spaces, not always, but on average, do tend to be more sex positive. And there have definitely been cases of men in the same spaces maybe causing some intentional or unintentional harm by taking advantage, which can unfortunately make women more wary around men. I think the movie The Love Witch actually explores this issue extremely well, as we see how the protagonist Elaine actively pursues sexual relationships for pleasure. And being comfortable with her own body means that she's perfectly okay with performing pagan ceremonies naked. But the sometimes sexual nature of these ceremonies puts her in positions that she's not entirely comfortable with men who are in a position of power over her. This seems to even affect the way that she views gender in general, as being in such a highly gendered space where men are viewed as gods and women as goddesses, but most of those men are taking advantage of women who can't speak out. She begins to associate masculine energy with abuse and feminine energy with weakness. Not only that, but she fails to recognize when her own masculine energy has become a problem because she associates masculine energy with men exclusively. In her mind, women are always the victim, so she sees absolutely nothing wrong with mocking her first lover for being too emotional, even going so far as to belittle him by comparing him to a little girl.
What a baby. I thought I'd found a real man. But he's just like a little girl.
She leaves her second lover depressed when he proves too domestic for her. And then she just murders the third lover, sitting there afterwards and wallowing in her own victimhood. I know that there are definitely people out there who get in the habit of taking advantage of people and then maybe can't be talked out of it. But at the same time, it's perfectly possible to behave this way without intending harm, just misreading the situation. But we are coming to understand more and more as women are starting to speak out that just because a woman is naked, that does not mean that she has consented to being touched. So part of the reason why I dwelled so long on the concept of masculine and feminine energy when I was talking about Wicca is that I do think that there's a potentially healthier approach to this concept of no harm within it. It's actually an approach that works for people of all genders equally, and it's literally just having respect for everyone's individual mix of masculine and feminine energy. And yes, that includes your own. Now, I'm non-binary, so I definitely have my own definition of what the mixing of these energies looks like. But that being said, you don't have to be non-binary to identify with this concept. Look at Patrick Swayze, for example. He took the role of drag queen Vita in the unfortunately titled To Wan Fu Thanks for Everything Julie Newmar, because he felt that even though he was a cishet man himself, he could strongly identify with the queer experience. In fact, he was hired for the role after improvising a 30-minute monologue about the bullying he received as a child being a boy who studied ballet.
So, Virgil, I gather you like hitting ladies.
Some ladies need to get hit.
Then, conversely, some men need to be hit back.
Terry Crews has built an entire career around subverting expectations with his more traditionally masculine appearance paired with his more sensitive and emotional personality. And then we have people like Serena Williams, who dominates in male-oriented fields despite maintaining her more feminine style. But also, because I am non-binary, I have to give a shout out to my own culture and mention people like Lady Gaga, Sasha Velour, and Dorian Electra, and also thank them for helping us open up this space of what mixed energies can look like. With our expanded ability to represent people in the media, we're also starting to see more experiences like season 13 contestant of RuPaul's Drag Race, Got Mick, a pansexual trans man who performs in drag professionally.
The world is not black or white. It is this craziest gray area, and that's what my drag is.
Personally, I have to admit that I adore Gottmik, mostly because I really enjoy viewing the experience of people who just do not at all follow the rules when it comes to gender. And I do feel that the internet has opened that space up quite a bit in recent years. On pretty much any social media platform, there are literally thousands of creators posting about whatever the heck they want. And depending on what you're looking for, that can allow you to take a peek into the lives of all sorts of people. Well, the dominant media has in recent past had a tendency to either reject or make a joke out of anyone that is considered unusual. In fact, it's still going on to this day, depending on what community you're part of. And I guess that's great if you're part of the mainstream. Not so much if you aren't. So yeah, anyone respectfully representing an slightly unusual perspective in the media is a huge win for me. I do think we're living in an extremely exciting time where a lot of our definitions and understandings of these traditional beliefs are changing. And for some people, that's a beautiful thing. It opens up a lot of freedom for people to just be true to themselves. Gone are the days where you could literally be tortured and publicly executed just for having a different opinion. But that doesn't mean that people aren't resistant to this change. After all, to some, this is a horrifying thought. It's proof that the witches have begun to run wild again. We're through here. Take it away, Barker. Thank you so much for your company tonight, gentlefolk. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please feel free to subscribe for news of our next tent, all about vampires. And please, don't forget to check out the Patreon on the way out. There, I did it. Happy now? Did you get what you wanted? Can I be real now? Of course. It's always the same with you. Need me for another video, huh? Don't even have the guts to kill me? Well, you know what?